Hello and welcome to the Longevity Challenge, Rewiring Economies for Longer Lives. I'm Juliet Mann. I'm a news anchor for CGTN Europe, which is China's international channel. And you know, I was reading a news article the other day which was talking about how we can prepare to become millionaire retirees. And it was a bit of a quiz. So you had to put in your age, type in your salary, put in your pensions contribution, hit enter, and I'm not on track. I'm not on track to become a millionaire retiree. Apparently, I shouldn't even consider retiring before the age of 77. And so, do you know what? I'm going to need a lot of help in navigating this longer life, because we're all living longer, which means that we're all going to be working for longer. But the World Health Organization expects the number of over 60s to double by 2050 to 2.1 billion people. And in Europe and in North America, there's substantial growth amongst older adults. By 2050, 1 in 4 of us will be over 65. And that's going to have big financial implications for individuals, sure, but also for society. The global ageing population means there's going to be more people in retirement. And already, the retirement systems that we have, they just can't cope. And the headlines, they scream panic, don't they? We hear about a silver tsunami, don't we? Or a demographic time bomb. But actually, there's an opportunity here. There's an opportunity for a bit of retirement rewiring. And that's what this session is going to be about today. This session is going to throw the spotlight on how to build financial resilience for consumers, for the workforce, for investors, and for leaders. And we've got a fantastic panel here, so let me introduce you to our panel. We've got Graham Pearce from Mercer. It's a consultancy which works very closely with WEF in the longevity space. We're going to talk to him about redesigning retirement and the pensions outlook. We've got Gok Soon Ju. You're from Skills Future in Singapore, and that's really innovative and exciting things happening around ageing society, so I'm looking forward to speaking to you. Linda Grattan, an organisational psychologist from the London Business School. I should say Professor Grattan, shouldn't I? You also co-wrote the seminal book, 100-Year Life, and another one around the future of work. So she's going to help explain a really different way of looking at longevity. And here we have Christian Keller, who's the chief economist at Barclays. So he's going to talk us through the numbers, really, and explain this demographic transformation that's taking place. So, look, I think let's start off by a little bit of context, a little bit of scene setting, everyone. And I'll start with you, Christian, because there are so many uncertainties in 2023. We're still recovering from the pandemic. There are conflicts, from Ukraine to Sudan. We have a refugee crisis. We have a cost of living crisis. We have this crazy high inflation. But there is one sure certainty, and that's that we're all going to live decades longer. So give us an overview of what that's going to mean for global growth in the near term.
Well, okay, first of all, I think it's a very valid point you make. We are in a time where we look a lot of the crises that hit us, right? And everything is unprecedented, unpredictable. And so we stumble from crisis to crisis. And we sometimes lose sight of things that are actually quite predictable. And, climate change is one, but even more predictable in terms of knowing what we're going to see in the next decade is really demographics. And it's something that we like to talk about. But then whenever something happens, we say, well, we can push it off, right? And we are actually at the moment at a pretty critical juncture. Our calculations are, for example, that the Chinese population actually next year may start already falling in absolute terms. We now, if you go to Europe, Germany, for example, there's now actually around this time now a kink where there are less and less people entering the labor market. We have obviously a lot going on in France where we see protests against increasing the lives or working lives. And it's something that is never relevant immediately in the short term because demographics does work over decades, but it's very dangerous to always pushing it off because there's always some crisis. And I think actually at this point, if you look at a lot of the statistics, and I may not bore you with all the numbers, but we are actually at a critical juncture, China, Europe, where right now some of the ratios, the typical ratios we look at, dependency ratios, age above 65 over over working age population. I would actually say we look at dependency ratios. We should also include people younger than 15, because it's very interesting. At the same time we're getting older, but there are also fewer children. So, a lot of these ratios change then a lot. But, and they all have a kink around this time. So the next decade is quite important. On the short term on growth, look, I think other factors probably play a bigger role than necessarily, what exactly the population growth rate is. But I would say we also already see some of the consequences. I mean, the fact that we have massive social unrest in France over, increasing the retirement age by 2 years shows you what Europe, in a way, has to look at as it needs to prepare its populations for, that they're aging, and maybe some of the generous pension schemes cannot be sustained. I know that a lot of analysts are looking at China and wonder whether they need to start correcting their forecasts for, some of the earnings forecasts for companies, because, population is now in a very dramatic way, by the way. I don't think this is always recognized. In a very, very dramatic way, China's demographics is going to change, because like the rest of the world, oh, this is embarrassing. Oh, I'm sorry. Like the rest of the world, they had a population boom really in the early 60s and until the end 70s, when they started the one child policy. So then they dramatically changed, and now you have all these people retiring, which is a large group, but you have no one coming. So they're doing something now that the rest of the world will experience, but in a very drastic way. So maybe you want to make one more point. So longer term growth will be affected, because if you have less population growth, automatically your global GDP numbers will be less. GDP per capita can still be good. And second, and I'll stop with this, is we have amassed a lot of debt. So, over the last 40 years, population stopped growing as quickly. But at the same time, over the last 40 years, we amassed a lot of debt. And that means that now a much smaller coming generation does not only have to pay for the elderly, but also deal with this debt burden that was amassed over the last 40 years.
And that's true. There are fewer people in the workforce paying per retiree. I wonder that looking at this demographic transformation that's taking place, there are going to be some positives, there will be some negative impacts on the global workforce. Linda, what do you think?
About what?
The positive and negative impacts on the global workforce.
Okay. I was sort of fortunate in many ways, because when I wrote The 100-Year Life, I wrote it as a psychologist, but with an economist. And it's that combination that brought all the insight. So here we are. That book has been very important in Japan, which is until recently, the world's oldest population and the world's most shrinking population. But as you quite rightly say, although Japan now has a whole centre for the 100-Year Life, it's actually China that is the next country up, because these are demographic changes which will affect every single country. What does that mean? Well, I was fortunate because I talk about work and how it means to work, but my colleague, Andrew Scott, an economist, worked out how long you would have to work if you had the sort of savings that most of us have. And that figure is 72 years. And so actually one of the things I decided to do was to work till 72, and I'll tell you how that goes in a couple of years' time. But then what happens is once you say, well, I'm going to work till 72, how do you feel about that? And of course, in Singapore, that's exactly what you're now talking to your citizens about. Everyone says, well, I can't possibly have the traditional full-time education, full-time work, full-time retirement, because you can't retire at 60 and live to 90. Well, apart from the financial aspect of it, how does it feel just from a social relationship aspect? So then we began to talk about something that's become quite important, actually, the idea that you need a multi-stage life. You need a life where you move in and out of different types of work at different stages, much more individualized. The 3-stage life is very much around age cohorts. If you knew somebody's age, you knew what stage of life they were at. But this is more individualized, and that means from a psychological perspective, People need more insight, and that's the work that you're doing in Singapore and we're doing in the UK actually, to give people insight from about their 50s on about what sort of life would you like, what would it look like, what would you want to do, how much do you save, how much do you want to give back to the community, and so on. Let me just say a couple of points about that. What we've found, and I'm a member of a research group in the UK who are looking at this in detail, is that the over 50s did not come back to work after the pandemic. And that's incredibly worrying for all of us, because once they don't come back at 50, they don't work. So we know now why they didn't come back. They didn't come back, and this is work from the Phoenix Institute, of which I'm a member. 3 reasons. Number 1, they were ill. And that says something about the health system, and I know you and I have just spoken about that in Singapore, which is very much more focused on health than it is on illness. Number 2, they're looking after somebody, they're caring for somebody, which actually in some cases is a grandchild. It's not always an aged parent. Number 3, and this is particularly so in the UK, they don't like their job. So this really also plays into the whole issue that we've been focusing in the WEF on, which is good work. One more thing to say, though, about that group. Let's say at 50 you wanted to find a new job. So you applied for a job, pretty well qualified. What then happens in that process? Well, what we know happens is that you are discriminated against. We have absolute data on this. That in fact, I have said publicly before, I'll say it again, that age discrimination is worse, in my view, and I speak as a woman, than gender discrimination. Horrible stereotypes about what 50-year-olds are like, and what 60-year-olds are like, and what 70-year-olds are like. So the point I would like to make in this panel today is this is a multi-stakeholder issue. Governments have to move, individuals have to move, but importantly, corporations have to move. And there are not enough of you. In fact, there are very few of you who are actively trying to retain and to bring in the over 50s. So my plea to you is, if we want to get over this enormous crisis which we've described, you have got to start actively employing people over the age of 50.
I want to talk about the corporate side of things in a moment, but you were bringing in Sunju, so I want to talk to you, because there are different approaches out there from country to country, from region to region. So tell us about what is happening in Singapore and the measures that are being put in place to address the ageing population.
Sure, yes. We are very cognizant of the ageing populations, and we're taking really important steps. So I'll just highlight 3 key points, and then we can always discuss later. One is we're redefining healthcare, not to treat people when they're sick, but now we are moving into healthier SG. Healthier Singapore means we have to take care of our health ahead of time, and that means we not just have long lifespans, but long and healthy lifespans. I think that about the total wellness. So we're focusing a lot on shifting from sick care to health care, real health care and well-being. So that's number 1, redefining health care. Number 2 is about redefining lifelong learning. So we invest in our people, in giving everybody $500 SkillsFuture credit from 25 and above. So as long as you're alive, you have the credits. And then from time to time, we see the consumption, we may top up again. I think that allowed people to take charge of how they want to see learning, how they want to readjust the kind of job role they are into something else. So the kind of adjacency, how they move across. So the lifelong learning will allow them to move in tandem of their life stages in terms of career. I think the third part of readjustment, I would say, is about redesigning workplaces to help people stay longer. So we have some success story among Singapore companies like our Sets Kitchen, which is the catering kitchens in the Changi Airport. They redesigned the whole workplace so that their 70-year-old can continue to stay in the job. Instead of asking them to carry heavy crates of potato, there's a robot that follows them. So the robots will carry the potato to the right place and then unload it, and they can continue to do the work. So it's part of automations to help the older generation stay in the work. So I think I can just briefly talk about these 3 points first, so we can discuss further later on.
That's interesting then. So the companies are adapting their workforces to accommodate the older population. But I wonder if it's sort of feeling as they go, or whether it's something that's now becoming more ingrained in the way they do business. Graham, let's bring you in. I mean, are companies listening? I mean, have retirement systems and setups and pensions changed in line with this demographic transformation?
Not yet, is what I would say. So if we went back a few decades, we had, in the developed world at least, a predominance of defined benefit pension plans. And what I mean by that is that people were promised a set amount of retirement income, usually linked to salary, that gave them an adequate retirement income after a full career. Gradually, due to more tight funding regulations, which created more cash volatility for sponsoring employers, and also accounting standards that required those assets and liabilities to be marked to market at regular intervals, that caused tremendous volatility of financing of those plans and has pushed virtually all companies in the private sector towards what we call defined contribution plans, which is where you pay a set amount of contribution into a pension plan each year, and then the individual typically is responsible for managing that and choosing how it's invested, and ultimately the benefits that will be provided are just what that pot of money provides when you need to take it. So you've moved away from this, what's almost like an insurance of an adequate retirement income, into something where your retirement income is just going to depend upon how much you've saved up and the financial conditions at the point at which you retire. So there's a lot more volatility in that. Much more recently, we've seen some of the more progressive companies starting to think about introducing minimum standards. So we've seen the talking about living wage and looking at how much you actually need to earn in order to be able to live, to provide basic level of income to live adequately, or you could set that at a different level to maybe allow you, more freedoms, the ability to eat out, the ability to go on holidays, for example. So companies will look at the different levels of income needed and try to target a living wage. Some companies are now looking at living pensions as being a target. That, I think, at the moment at least, is proving challenging, because the one thing that everybody underestimates is the cost of providing an adequate retirement income. And if you think about what we've just discussed here, if you're going to work for 35 years, say, or 40 years, and be in retirement for 35 or 40 years, and you earn on your investments, you manage to keep your investments up with real salary growth, if you're paying in for the same amount of time as you're going to be taking money out, actually, if you pay 5% of your salary into a pension, you can expect to get a retirement pension of 5% of your final salary, which is probably a lot lower than what people think they're going to get from that money. And that's a ticking time bomb, when we talked about time bombs before, that I think is yet to be addressed. And we've seen it happen in some of the countries that moved to defined contribution plans earliest, like the US. When the financial crisis hit, just as companies actually needed higher turnover, we found that a lot of people couldn't afford to go into retirement because they had way less than they'd had 2 years before. In 2009, the value of their savings was way less than it had been in 2007, and the cost of purchasing a retirement income had also gone up for a given amount of money. So you had this double whammy of the falling amount of retirement accumulated savings and also lower rates of interest. And that's only got worse over the last 20 years. So what we see at the moment is actually you have a whole generation of people in defined contribution plans that will not be able to enjoy the same level of retirement income that the current retirees are enjoying in developed countries.
And they're not enjoying them, but also because they are going to be living longer and working longer. So, and there's a resistance, isn't there, in many places to having to work longer, even though, because we're living longer, might be living healthier lives with companies and governments focusing more on well-being. That might make us feel we need to work. But if we see what's happening in France, I mean, great example, they want to nudge up the retirement age from 62 to 64, and the workforce aren't having any of it.
Yeah. I mean, one comment, this value of annuities, it's amazing, and even if for financial educated people to realize, if I wanted from the age of 60 or so until, let's assume, 30 more years, a certain monthly income, I would recommend everyone put it in an Excel spreadsheet, do annuity. You know, the amount of money you need to have saved up by then is just amazingly high. And I think it's something probably very early on in schools one should teach children. You know, even if you don't have to be an actuarian, but I mean, but look on something I looked up because on the question on France, it's just, you know, one has to just realize life expectancy. This is a global number. Imagine this is a number that includes developing countries and everyone. Life expectancy, according to the UN, at the age 1950 was 46 years average. 2022, 71. So now over that time span, it was 70 years. You know, we increased it from 46 to 71, and at the same time, you know, the retirement ages almost barely moved, and now we are fighting over 2 years. And now, look, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty and whether the way Macron did it. You know, this is not the subject here. But the fact is, and in particular in Europe, and in particular I think in older societies, that includes probably Japan, there needs to be a social dialogue. You know, if we continue by governments just trying each year to do something about lifting the age or so, and then the entire not the entire working population, but those who are, unionized, etc., just fighting against, that won't work, right? I think that really needs to be an engagement where one rethinks how one thinks about this. Maybe work patterns need to change. Lifelong learning, maybe also that people, they maybe cannot be expected to do the same job when they get older, even if they're healthy. But maybe we need to think of that careers peak, but then there's nothing, dishonor about it to continue to working, but no longer in that top job. So I think these are things that need to be discussed.
This comes right back to what Linda was saying about this change of mindset that's needed, from not just from the individual point of view, but all the way up to corporations, to governments, and to move away from this three-stage life. Talk us through that a little bit more.
So really the whole way that we thought about our lives was based on the predictability of those three stages, that you would be in education, you would be at work, and you would retire. And I think from a psychological perspective, what was interesting about that is that everybody went through the stage at the same time. So you could imagine everybody walking together, and at the age of 20, you look around and say, what's everyone doing? Oh, I'm going to do the next thing. And at the age of 60 or 62, you look around and say, well, what's everybody doing? You didn't need to be a social pioneer. You didn't have to build anything yourself. I mean, you didn't have to read a book about managing your career. You just did what everybody else did. And I think the real challenge with this three-stage, the multi-stage life, which is really the only way to live a long life, there isn't any other way, is that it requires both flexibility on the part of companies in terms of flexible working practices and insights and skill development. On the part of government, it requires a conversation. I absolutely agree with you about the conversation, and that's one of the things that Abe did in Japan, is he actually created a council on the 100-year life, which had representatives from all of the major ministries and the heads of the universities and so on. And we spent 2 years talking about what would we do, how would we come, and they made a whole set of recommendations, by the way, which were very specific to Japan. So government needs to be involved, but then people need to be involved. And let me just say something about that. One of the experiments we recently ran with the Institute is that we took people aside over a period of time, using workshops, talking about the fact that annuities and this and that and everything, and how multi-stage life. And at the end of it, the researchers asked, now what will you do differently? And you know what most people said? Human. Actually, you're an economist, so you probably don't know what humans think. What do you think the humans thought?
I don't know, you don't.
They said, we're not going to do anything different.
Okay, all right. Yeah,
no, they didn't do what you and I would thought they would, which is great. Now we're going to have a multi-stage life. They said, we're not going to do anything different. And I think that's a sort of fundamental, that's one of the fundamental. So we've got two actors here in this stakeholder, neither of whom want to move. So companies are doing really, honestly, very little. Every now and again, I think, I'm going to write a Harvard Business Review article about what we're doing to, for the over 50s. I can't get enough case studies, literally, to make an article. But
this is the thing, isn't it? I mean, Graham,
and individuals are going, I don't think I have to think about that. But as you say, and the data, and you know this from Mercer, is that there will be mass poverty. I mean, this is the truth of it. There will be mass poverty of the over 60s unless we do something. Singapore, of course, is an astonishing country. I'm sorry I referred to it as a company because it does things so well, like a well-run multinational. But, you know, the focus on skills is very, very smart. Because, you know, if you want to employ somebody over the age of 50, they've got to be skilled. And government has to play a role in that. And Singapore does an astonishing, and has done for years actually, on upskilling their citizens.
Julie, I can just jump in here to just unpack a little of what Linda said about in Singapore. So yes, we look at every citizen must realize everybody's fullest potential. And that's the reason why we invest heavily in the front end of education, but continue to invest in everybody throughout life stages. So in early this year, we just talked about national career health. Everybody must have a career health, and we can manage. We know what skills we have. We know what career we've gone through. We can make adjustment in terms of our life stages, what kind of job you want to go into, what kind of skills you need, and then you can get into the kind of work, and it's fully supported by the government, and the data insights will allow you to say, okay, this is an important skills. Do I want these skills because I need this job? Do I have these skills? So we are trying to use data, use technology to do personalized service. At the same time, is trying to push for more, let everybody access career coaching, because career coaching is very important. It's not. You don't do it when you're out of job. You need it to plan your life, plan your career throughout the life stages. So those companies who have career coach is fantastic. Like myself, I'm a volunteer career coach of public service. It's fantastic to talk to people about how to plan their life, and then how they want to pivot, how much time they want to do in kind of paid work, unpaid work. So it's quite important for us to have this kind of system and framework in place.
So you're talking about prioritising education and upskilling at all stages of life, and also this mentorship piece is also really important. So, you know, Graham, we're talking here about how important it is to adapt and rewrite the system. All of this makes sense on paper. So how do you then get everyone mobilised to do something about it rather than just talk about the problem?
Well, I think at the end of the day, whether you talk about governments or whether you talk about private corporations, it's all about the business case. So companies are going to do this. They're going to invest in keeping workers productive for longer if they can see a return on it. And maybe for exactly the reasons that Christian's just outlined about the fact that in so many countries we're going to see far fewer people entering the workforce in the next few years, maybe that will provide the drive for companies to actually invest much more heavily and really make a difference in actually keeping people for longer and making sure that the jobs can be adapted to suit what people aged over 50 are looking for. Because as you said, Linda, too many people are leaving the workforce because they actually don't feel that they can cope well in the environment that they find themselves in.
There have been some pilot schemes, though, haven't there? I mean, Linda, maybe you can talk us through some of these with some companies that are not sitting still, that are changing the factory floor.
Most companies are sitting still. I mean, honestly, it was interesting. I talked to a very, very smart CHRO this morning who said to me, you know, it's very obvious, Linda, that within the next 5 years, we will have a major skill shortage in Europe. And I said, have you thought about the over 50s? He said, no. Well,
which companies are focusing on the over 50s? Have you got some examples in Singapore? Have we got some examples in Europe?
I mean, you know, I could give you examples, and they're the same old examples. You know, BMW have changed their factory so that it can accommodate people over the age of 50. Quite a lot of retailers actually are beginning to work with the over 50s because, I mean, clearly when everyone ages, your consumers age, and consumers would like, you know, if you walk into a B&Q store, which is one of the sort of stores in Europe, which sells, you know, DIY stuff, you'd like to potentially to have somebody of your own age giving you advice. So retail has been pretty good, actually. Manufacturing has been pretty good. Professional service firms have done very little, I think, although they are saying they are. I really am being honest here because I'm a academic, so it's easy for me to say what I see really, and what I observe is, frankly, we're just not doing enough. We're not doing enough, and we need to do what governments need to do what Singapore has done, and companies need to completely re-evaluate their whole talent pipeline and ask themselves, are we discriminating against people over the age of 50? It may be actually, by the way, that governments move on this. Governments might decide that that discrimination against age is as bad as discrimination against gender. In which case, there'll be a whole slew of regulations which companies will have to start thinking about. I'm not sure if it will get to that, but I wouldn't be surprised. So there's a lot to be done. This is just the beginning of this conversation.
And there are many places around the world, aren't there, Christian, where the pension systems, the retirement schemes are just not sustainable. You know, China haven't announced anything official, but there are some considerations because their retirement age is 60, and they're thinking of incrementally of phasing it up, having people work for shorter time, but then teaching and mentoring some of the younger members of the workforce. In terms of what you would like to see in company reports, in terms of the numbers and the statistics, what is going to make a difference? What should governments do?
I think, first of all, what's important to realize is the type of pension system that you run doesn't make a difference. In Europe, I know when it happened after the global financial crisis, they pointed to the US, see, they have defined contributions, and now all their savings are worth a lot less. Isn't it so much better, our system, which is a pay-as-you-go, where you basically pay out pension from the contributions that you collect at the same time? So, you know, pensioners in Europe may have the illusion that somehow they pay a contribution that's being saved. No, it's paid immediately out. They're going to feel the pressure too. The government can promise to pay their pension, but they need to squeeze it from those who are working by raising contributions, meaning, you know, they don't get away from dealing with that demographic situation. And in China is a bit like this because, you know, they are having a very low pension age. There are going to be a lot of people entering, and at the same time, there's no one coming, or very few people coming into the labor force. So what you need to do then is change the parameters. Make people work longer. That's what one attempt is in Europe. Reduce pensions, no one likes that, or increase contributions. But, you know, there's only so many parameters you can work with, and it's simple arithmetics, and, you know, it will have to be done. And the longer you wait, the more drastic it will be. So my first recommendation, exactly, do it as early. The earlier you do it, the less you have to do. But unfortunately, because people don't feel it yet, there were many bumper years in the recent decades where Europe had actually, particularly countries like Germany, had an overflow, actually. They had excess in the pension, and they would just spend it, and, you know, just have new benefits they would give out, which every politician loved, instead of saving it and creating a little bit of a saving cushion to deal with the demographic changes coming now. I think now they're starting, but unfortunately too late.
I mean, do you think that your global economic outlook might change if there were some big strides made, you know, from government, from industry, from academia to come up with a gear shift, a joined-up framework here?
I think the immediate change would take place really through labor markets. You mentioned it. You know, right now, what we all economists are stunned about, and which has a big impact on inflation, by the way, because the wages are driven up by not enough supply. And there are many people who could be working and they're not working, and we need to find out why. If they enter the labor force, you have more labor working, probably on average at less wages, which sounds bad, but it's actually not a bad thing, because if more people working, you know, the wage bill overall goes up, but you don't have the inflation pressure. That would have an impact on the outlook, even in the short term, if it was to happen over the short term, yeah.
One of the reasons that Linda mentioned was because some people might be caring for others younger or older, which makes me think about healthcare systems. They need a shake-up too.
Well, interestingly enough, one of the recommendations that the Arbe report on the 100-year life came up with was childcare. You know, and you'd think, well, what's childcare got to do with a 100-year life? Well, it was actually to take caring responsibilities from women, because in Japan, they wanted to get women into the workforce, which they've pretty much done, actually. But you're right. I mean, actually, it's a complex set of issues. Can I just mention one other point which we haven't talked about yet, and it's really fundamental, which is one of the reasons why it's difficult to say that the pension age should be 67, let's say, or 68, is that as people age, the variance within the age cohort increases. So, you know, a 60-year-old, the variance within 60-year-olds is very, very wide. And as they age, it gets wider and wider and wider. And that's why it's so difficult to make one judgment about, you know, a 67-year-old, because you could be a 67-year-old running a marathon, or you could be a 67-year-old who's struggling to stand up. And that's why, you know, it's so hard for a government to say it should all be 67. And so pensions, and this is the complexity of pensions really, has to somehow acknowledge that there will be, within any society, a number of 67-year-olds who actually can't work. And the other issue is, if you've had done manual work, let's say you've been a truck driver until the age of 50, this is not a job for a 60 or a 70-year-old truck driver. It's already an unhealthy job, by the way, but it's not a job for a 70-year-old. So, you know, we have to, reskill people out of manual work in their 50s so that they can move into work that's not manual, but B, also acknowledge massive age cohort diversity.
There's not one size fits all. That's certainly what I'm getting here. So I just wonder, in terms of what you'd like to see, in terms of public policy, in terms of what policymakers can do to address all of these changes that are happening in society, in the workforce, and in the makeup of the population.
Yeah, in Singapore, we already implemented the re-employment scheme, whereby when individuals reach so-called the pseudo-retirement age, companies are obliged to issue contracts on an annual basis, and the job can be redesigned to something else. You need not go back to the same jobs. So that allowed the flexibility on both ends, the employees and the employer, to decide what is the best deal for both. I think this should continue, definitely, for sure. In terms of the ageism, so-called ageism, I would think that perhaps sometime this ageism concept is a kind of convenient excuse, because it will take a lot more efforts for line manager and HR, human resource manager, to rethink how to take advantage of this demographic premium. I call it premium, it's not a tsunami, that demographic premium, because they are experienced, they have a deep knowledge, but how do we take advantage of this demographic premium and to rethink how can I design work, take advantage? It can be, I don't need you to drive the trucks, but can I get you to train someone else, do something, because you have the in-depth knowledge. So I think that part of capability currently is not spoken a lot and not thought through. I think we should, perhaps in the next book, you should promote that. to help company and line managers to rethink, I don't always need a young, warm body, but the task, the kind of activities may be warrant for someone with experience and age, because you can't earn it without going through that year experience. So I think that the redesigning job requires a lot more deeper thinking to make it happen.
Just an example of that, you have to be pretty old to have lived through an inflationary environment. Some of us in this room have. That's a really important skill right now, to understand what happens when you're living in inflation. Yeah.
So Graham,
the trading for were trading bonds, and they all traded just for the last 10, 15
and they have
years.
never,
For the first time,
exactly,
interest rates going up.
Exactly that. Crystalline intelligence.
so there's something to be said here about not seeing the ageing population as a burden, but as an opportunity. What do you think, Graham?
I absolutely agree. As I say, it's all about trying to keep people productive for longer. That will produce a greater amount of income for the economies that we're representing here. And what we need to also do is realise that we can't carry on with this idea of a fixed retirement age and a retirement income from that point, to expect to have enough for everybody at that point onwards. That we have to recognise the diversity. We have to recognise that there will be some people forced to retire much earlier due to ill health or due to the nature of their job, or a combination of them both, that will need support earlier. And there'll be some people who can actually afford to provide for themselves for much longer and save up, and may need a lot less assistance from pension funds or the state.
So an ageing population isn't bad for the economy?
It doesn't have to be.
It's complicated.
It doesn't have to be, and I really do think the rhetoric around it has to change. I think whenever we deteriorating, worsening demographics, just because the population gets old, and at the same time this jubilant, great demographics just because population growth is high. We have many examples where actually high population growth does not lead to high per capita GDP growth. Actually, individuals get better year by year. And so, I think there's a bit of a simplistic narrative around how we view populations which are young or older. And I think that is already would be a good beginning to start talking about it differently.
I want to go around the panel because taking in all of the things we've said here and just think, gosh, if you could go back in time and give advice to your 20-year-old self, what would it be in terms of preparing maybe yourself for retirement, or maybe becoming a campaigner, or maybe trying to set some steps in motion? Now, I know you said you think that people at school should learn more about annuities and know more about personal finance. What would you tell your 20-year-old self, Christian?
Know the simplest math of, interest, compound interest, and annuities maybe a bit far, but like have an idea of those concepts. The power of time, I think that's important, and aging is about time, right? What compounding does, I think that's one. And second, when I hear about the differences, the variance of how people, in what shape people are when they get old. I mean, a lot of this is determined at a young age, right? So I will not become like giving it health advice here, but I will tell my children to be careful, that health is not something to think about only in your 20s, and you can do a lot, but a lot of the things that people suffer later are probably often have to do, if they're not genetics, with how they live at the younger age. And I think there's a growing, there's a growing realization of that already among the younger.
So become financially literate, but also focus on that well-being before it's maintenance, or rather than repair work that's going on. Linda, how about you?
Well, I would like Christian. I would talk about time, and I think when you're young, it's very hard to imagine that you have a whole life ahead of you, and that you can actually move time around. You don't have to do everything all at once. And the idea that you could actually take bits of what you want to do and be and move them forward, or even move them back. So what I certainly do with my MBA students is help them think about their whole timeline, and obviously try and find work that they love. Because if you love what you do, then you're more likely to carry on wanting to learn, because being a lifelong learner is just such an important part of having a good life.
And what did you think you do? I mean, if you're thinking too that people in government and organisations are trying to deal with the now, and changing things for the future isn't necessarily top of the list.
I thought it's quite important that we talk about from young, at 20, we know about financial literacy, invest for our future, our well-being literacy. And I thought there's one more thing that today not every one of us are aware of, is the skills literacy. Is what do we have as we go around participating in activities. It can be school sports, it can be something competition, it can be things that we like to do, but what is that accumulated skills literacy? So it's like you just imagine we have a Lego bricks, we keep accumulating Lego bricks, but today we need to make it more evident and more aware of this skill literacy, so that we can always reassemble ourselves for different parts of life. So I would add on skill literacy as an important thing.
I like that, seeing ourselves as sort of a Lego minifigure where we can take off a little bit and add another skill set. Graham, I'm going to flip this around a little bit for you. So instead of saying what you'd look back at and tell your 20-year-old self, what would you tell people around the room, and maybe people a little bit older, I'm sort of talking to myself, people the over 50s, what advice would you give them in terms of becoming more prepared for how the global workforce is going to change? Yeah,
I mean, I think taking the perspective then at 50, it's probably a mixture of everything you've just discussed around looking after your health. When we look, I mean, as you said, people leave the workforce not because they've saved up enough for retirement usually. The vast majority of people leave due to ill health, or because they're forced out, or because they hit a mandatory retirement age. Even if that's becoming less common these days, it's still an issue. And so these are things you can't control. So the thing is to work out how much have you actually got in savings? How is it invested? What dependents do you have that you're going to need to look after? How can you make sure that you keep yourself healthy, but how can you make sure you've got adequate protection to get you through periods of long-term sickness or disability? Do you have insurance? Can you still get insurance? Life insurance for any outstanding debts that you might still have, for example, from a property. How much do you need to be able to live, as a minimum in retirement? So how much would you actually need to save up for to be able to have the minimum you need? What do you need to be able to do that? Are you adequately protected against inflation? Hopefully the last couple of years have actually raised that problem in people's minds, because when you're talking about the next 30 or 40 years, a lot of the people who've retired in the last 10 years who bought an annuity with no pension increases whatsoever are now realising what that actually means in terms of actual buying power, and that can be a real problem when you're no longer able to work, or able to work enough to save up much more. So I think it's really about doing a full health check, looking at what you've got, what protections you've got, maybe getting rid of the protections you don't need anymore and using those funds for things that you really do need.
So very much, a lot of that's on the individual. So personal health checks to get your own finances in order. But Linda, you also think that companies need to take on more responsibility and rewire their systems and the way they work. And that's something that we're already seeing governments doing, and maybe there are other organisations and countries that can learn from Singapore's example. And taking all of those things together, an ageing economy, ageing population might end up being a good thing for the global economy, right?
Yeah.
It's the next new growth.
It's the next new growth.
It's the next new growth. Well, I'd like to say thank you to our audience, thank you to everybody who's taken part, and thank you very much to our panel. So much to talk about.
Yeah.
I think these conversations are going to disappear into the corridors of power, and we'll be continuing this for much longer.
Thank you.
Christian,
Thank you.
Graham, Linda,
Thank
and
you.
Sungu, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.